Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Safe, Vibrant, and Healthy Community Committee meeting. Today, we are going to be hearing more about text change 1907 outdoor seating in annex zoning districts. And Pat Young, I believe, with planning is here to speak to us. Hi, Pat.
Good morning, Mayor and members of the committee. Good to be here this morning, and thank you for having us. As you heard from the Mayor, we're going to do a quick overview, follow-up from our last meeting on outdoor seating at bars in NX. So, Derek, if I have the presentation there. So, as you'll recall, the genesis of this item was interest from a developer who was building a new development and wanted to have a bar in the NX district and found the current 8-seat limitation on outdoor seating very limiting and very deleterious to the success of bars in the NX district. You'll recall the intent of the NX district is to have supportive commercial uses close to residential, convenience retail, small-scale retail, coffee shops, dry cleaners, and things like bars. So staff felt like that was worthy of exploring with you all's endorsement to take to this committee. There was a report provided in July, and it appeared before you all in late August. You all asked for additional follow-up research on sound attenuation and the basis of standards, along with a number of other changes, which I'll summarize today. Again, as I said, this is you're looking at the viability of bars and taverns in this post-COVID and COVID environment, while ensuring and balancing the quiet enjoyment of use of adjacent property. So based on you all's direction, we did additional research. We looked at a lot of our peer cities, including Charlotte, Charleston, Wilmington, Greensboro, and Baltimore, Maryland, who have some really good regulations. As you're all well aware, there are been a whole series of changes that were intended to be temporary during the COVID pandemic, but both the temporary and the permanent measures, are really looking at balancing the concern about noise impacts on neighborhoods, but allowing significant amounts of outdoor seating with the ensuring that the noise ordinances are complied with. And I think this is a good time to remind you all that there is, of course, a citywide noise ordinance that would remain in effect, regardless of this, that limits noise from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. to 45 decibels in residential districts. So we've come back to you with three options today. The first is remove limitations on outdoor seating. We won't talk a lot about that because I think that could result in very high amounts of outdoor seating that could be negative, have negative impacts on adjoining neighborhoods. Option two is increasing the maximum seating allowable for outdoor seating. And option three is inclusive of option two, increase the maximum number of available seats for outdoor seating, but to allow for a greater amount of outdoor seating with limited use standards and with a special use. So our staff recommendation is to increase the current limit is 8 seats to up to 20 seats by right. So in excess of 20 seats, a special use permit would be required, and that this increase in seating would have standards for separation and noise mitigation that would be embedded in. So here's an example, a graphic. The current standard only allows 8 seating locations. That's generally 2 tables. This would allow up to 5 tables. So again, I'll talk a little bit about, well, I'll go ahead and do that now. So we did do research on, which is limited, but definitely exists on the noise expectation. So there's a group called the Center for Hearing and Communication, which is a audiologists based in New York that have done research that show that the average decibel level of a crowded restaurant or bar is about 85 decibels, and that's inside. And that the average quiet residential street is about 40 decibels. So the feeling from staff was that over 20 seats, there is the risk of getting at those close to those 70 and 80 decibel levels, which would warrant the attenuation, which I'll talk about here in a minute in terms of our recommendations. But that between 8 and 20, you would not be getting to those high typically at average volume conversations, you would not be getting to those high levels of noise. And as I mentioned earlier, there is a noise ordinance that remains in effect. There is an existing prohibition on live performances and live music and dance floors that would also remain in effect that would help contribute to that reduction in noise. So we are also further proposing that if an applicant wanted to go over 20 seating positions, that they would have to get a special use permit that would require either a 100-foot separation requirement. We happen to have in our staff probably the only urban planner in America that has a physics degree as an undergraduate, which is Ken Bowers. Ken did some detailed research and calculations on this and showed that under normal circumstances, again, assuming relatively flat topography and things of that nature, that at 100 feet you'd get about 44 decibels of attenuation. So that would take that 85 level down to 40. But with the special use permit, there could be site-specific evidence presented that showed that those that attenuation would occur, and which is why we're recommending the special use permit. And then we also acknowledge that you could have a lower separation, say up down to 40 feet, with a solid fence or wall and 10 feet of landscaping. That's very similar to our current NX transition standards that would be in effect for all new development between NX and adjacent residential districts. So with that, I'll be happy to take any questions or comments you have or any further direction.
So one thing I'd ask for, Pat, in this presentation was to give us some visual examples of the kind of like what this would look like. Like, okay, so you have residential. Is that single family homes? Is it apartments? Tell me what we're talking about here. That's where you lost me last time and I'm still not there.
Sure. Derek, could you pull the presentation back up, please? Yeah, that's, oops. Yeah, so under our recommendation, with the going from the 8 to the 20, there would not be any separation requirement or attenuation required. What that looks like, it varies significantly. We weren't able to get photographs, but we did the closest that the residential districts were about 45 feet. And that was over at, if you know, the My Way Tavern on St. Mary's Street, adjacent to Cameron Park. So they serve food, so they already have several dozen outdoor seats. But so that they would not actually qualify there. So we did these graphics. We certainly can bring back if there's a need to show more ground level visuals. But again, we're looking at this 100 feet as being over 20 seating positions would be the appropriate for that.
All right, I'm having a hard time visualizing this, and being specific in what you're talking about. I think the last time what I asked was, give me some examples, like, so I can see it, and you're not just telling me about it. Can you give me an example using, like you mentioned, place near that I've never heard of? Anything?
Sure. So certainly we can go back and go to example sites that would be eligible to use these provisions and take perspective pictures. I'm sorry that we missed that direction last time. We absolutely can do that and bring that back. The graphic that's up now shows what would be required for any new development. So if there was a new, any new bar in an NX would require a transitional buffer between the bar and the residential use. So in that, with that new development, there would be requirement for landscaping, a fence or wall, and for new construction, it would be 50 feet required between those. So we certainly feel like that's provides a high level of noise attenuation.
So
the issue becomes for existing taverns, and we've identified about 15 of them that are in NX. And it varies significantly about the proximity to residential uses. But again, the minimum we found was about 40. And that was a location that also, was a restaurant, so it had a higher, there's no limit on outdoor seating for restaurants.
Okay, so you said you've identified about 15. Are there any examples of that?
Sure. So we had some of that in our last presentation. I don't have that with me today. The Piper's Tavern on Falls of the Neuse is an example. Although again, they I believe serve food, so they might not be subject to this. But they're well over 100 feet away from the nearest adjacent use, which is to the east. We certainly, if you wanted me to, we could take additional photos, and I'd have to bring that information back. I'm sorry, we didn't do that level of field work, but we certainly can and bring that back to you at your next meeting.
If we could take the presentation down, I saw that Councilor Cox had his hand raised. So, Councilmember Cox.
Yes, I have a couple questions. If you can go back to your diagram showing the 40-foot distance. Okay, is that 40 feet to the property line, or is that 40 feet to the structure?
So it's 40 feet to the structure is what we would propose. It could be property line to structure. We felt like attenuating the sound at the structure was what was most significant.
Well, how are you going to measure that if you can't get on private property in order to measure it?
Well, we could scale that off from aerial photography within a foot or so.
Mm-hmm. And can you provide a diagram showing for 20 people what the decibels would be that are produced based on distance from the crowd? And that showed, 20 people are going to produce a certain decibel level as part of normal conversation, and that'll attenuate the further away you get. So can you provide a graph that shows, how loud the noise is, how loud the conversations will be right next to the group versus further away?
Right. So we did do a fair bit of digging in that question, Councilmember Cox. We were not able to find in the public domain research that looked at that question specifically. I think we'd have to hire an acoustics expert to write up a.
Do that. I don't think you'd have to do that.
Excuse me, Councilor Cox. Excuse me.
I said I had several questions.
Excuse me,
I'll raise my hand again, but I have several questions and several comments.
You are violating the code of conduct once again.
I'm not violating the code of conduct. I have several questions and several comments. My hand is up. I told you at the beginning I had several questions.
Councilmember Cox, please stop.
You stop.
We will bring you up for censure.
You do that
right now.
I welcome you to do that.
It will be lovely. Thank you. Please do not interrupt the staff. That's number one. You've done that now several times. Number two, raise your hand. When I acknowledge you, you may ask your question. We are going to continue to have decorum in these meetings. We're not going to interrupt people, and we are not going to be bullied. Now stop it. I'm calling right now for a break in this meeting. Thank you. We have returned back from our meeting. I'm going to remind everybody from the council that they need to obey the rules of decorum and the code of conduct. You may raise your hand. I will call on you. You will not interrupt staff. You will let them continue to speak. We are going to do a restart here. Councilmember Cox, I believe that you were asking a question and Pat Young was answering that question. I would like for him to finish answering that question. When he's done with that, please raise your hand. I will acknowledge you where you can ask your second question. Thank you. Pat, we will start with you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Councilmember Cox, to your question from before the break, we tried very hard to find some information that was publicly available that looked at decibel levels created by different numbers of people in an outdoor setting, preferably a bar. We weren't able to find that. We certainly, if you have access to that or know where we can find it, we're happy to refer to that. What I think we would have to do in order to get specific audio, sound, decibel contour information for that is to either hire an outside party to set up an experiment or for us to do it ourselves with staff and with staff equipment. We don't have those measuring devices, but the police do and our code enforcement officials. So we believe that going from 8 to 20 was a very modest impact. It's basically adding 2 tables, 2 to 3 tables. We have examples from lots of restaurants in the community that have significantly more outdoor seating, and we have not had any substantial noise complaints that staff or I are aware. So I hope that answers your question. I'm happy to take any follow-up.
Councilmember Cox.
No, it does not answer my question. It should be possible to be able to determine, for a given noise level, how it attenuates by distance. That information is readily available on the internet.
Is that a question, Councilmember Cox?
Yes, I'm leading up to it. I'm leading up to the question. I'm providing some background information. Is it acceptable that I provide some background information?
It seems to me that you're talking down to the staff.
I'm providing some additional information. And I'm not in agreement with what the director said. My question is, you should be able to find, and I ask that you find on the internet, on Google, it's easy to find it, information about how noise attenuates over distance. And then I would like to have some estimate. I'm asking for an estimate, and it should be possible to come up with some sort of an estimate as to the decibel level that 20 people would make in typical conversation. That information should also be readily available over the internet.
Councilmember, thank you for your follow-up question, and certainly we absolutely can provide and calculate sound attenuation over space. And as I mentioned in my presentation, based on the calculations Ken Bowers did, the 100 feet of distance would attenuate about approximately 44 decibels under normal conditions. Again, topography, reflective surfaces, etc. The missing variable was a credible estimate of the amount of noise that 20 people having a conversation would be. We can certainly sharpen our pencils and bring that back to you.
Councilmember Cox.
Yes, if you could make sure that you provide this back in as part of a written analysis, that would be tremendous. Thank you.
Sir, thank you.
Could you put the presentation back up? I have a question related to that. Councilmember Cox, my question is next. I'll call on you after that. If you go to the beginning where you made the 3 recommendations, one was remove the limitations, the second was increase the maximum, and what you're suggesting is 20 seats.
Yes, ma'am.
correct? Okay. And then maintain or expand current maximum seating allowance based on proximity to residential use, with exception for residential and mixed-use developments. So explain option 3 to me in some more detail, if you would.
Sure. So option 3 is intended to say the exception for residential and mixed use basically would make it explicit that if there was, say, an NX development with a residential above a bar, that they would not be subject to these standards. So I think that's something we would want to seek kind of inclusive as part of option 2 as well, and it should have been characterized that way. The maintain or expand current maximum seating allowance based on proximity really gets to the idea that over 20 seats, that a special use permit or a site-specific evaluation would be warranted to make sure that sound is attenuated appropriately. And again, I think these could have been framed better, but that was the intent of that option.
Okay, so really what we're talking about is if we increase the maximum number, we would also want to have option 3 in there, because that kind of pulls out that exception.
Yes, ma'am. I think really option 2 and 3 are in staff's recommendation are together. Yes.
Okay. Councilmember Cox, you had a question?
Yes, my other question is, we've had this discussion about sound. I'd like to also understand what the impacts of lighting would be on adjacent neighborhoods, on adjacent residential. So what additional lighting would be permitted, and how would that impact the adjacent residential?
Well, so Councilmember, we didn't have any intent or any direction to change the lighting standard. We certainly can do some research on that and on the impact of the existing standard, but there's no proposal to modify those.
I guess that would be my request then, would be to look into those impacts, because if you're going to increase the number of seats, then I would think there would be an expectation that you would increase the amount of lighting.
Councilmember Fort?
Yes, one quick question. Mr. Young, did I understand you to say there are probably 15 or so facilities that this would impact, or do you have like a number of establishments that would be impacted by this change?
Yeah, Councilmember, that's an approximate number. There's no existing database of pre-existing. The vast majority of these institutions predated the NX district, right? And so, and then several of them started out maybe as bars or taverns, but then converted to restaurants, which has a different, has no limitation on outdoor seating. So we can certainly, if you all want to hold this item, we can sharpen that up and try to do a more thorough census. It may be impossible to get every single one, but we can bring back a list. And as the mayor suggested, some ground level site video or photography that would show the impacts in a more accessible manner.
Councilmember Fort, do you have any additional questions?
No, that was the only question I had. Thank you, Mayor.
Okay. Does anyone else have any additional questions of Pat or staff? So this has been sitting in committee for a while now. I think that my questions have been satisfied. I'm going to make a motion to approve option 2 and 3 and bring this forward to council for further discussion. Do I have a second? Councilmember Fort has seconded. Okay, all in favor, please raise your hands. No one was opposed. Clerk? Councilor Cox had a few questions. Pat, if you can bring that forward either in the city manager's report or in a background report to council.
Certainly, Mayor. Well, if you would indulge me, let me quickly recap what I've got in terms of staff follow-up to make sure we're clear. The first is to get ground level video and photography of subject properties relative to adjacent residential, so that you all would have a better sense of what it looks and feels like.
I think one would be sufficient.
Okay. We'll get a few examples, and then try to have a more detailed census of these eligible, applicable existing establishments, with a list of locations and names. We'll certainly do that, and then to look at the impact, essentially summarize and characterize the impacts of existing lighting standards, and then of the noise generated by different amounts of people outdoors, and more detailed written information on the attenuation over space. So those are things we'll bring back with you.
Councilor Fort, you had a question?
Mr. Young addressed my item on his follow-up list, Mayor. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Young, for the presentation.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you so much. That being said, we will adjourn this meeting, and this will come back before us at the council meeting on December 1st. Thank you, everybody. Happy Thanksgiving.